There is a particular kind of suffering that has no visible wound. You are not bleeding, you are not broken. From the outside, your life looks completely fine, maybe even good. You have people around you, you have things to do. You wake up every morning, you go through the motions, you perform the version of yourself that the world expects. But inside, something is relentlessly spinning. A thought arrives, then another thought about that thought, then a fear about what that fear means, then a question about whether you are handling everything correctly, whether you made the right choice 5 years ago, whether the people you love secretly find you exhausting, whether you are wasting your life, whether you will ever feel genuinely at peace, or whether this spinning is simply what being alive feels like now. You lie down at night and your mind refuses to stop talking to you. This is not a modern problem. This is not caused by your phone, your job, or your circumstances. This is something far older, far deeper. And one man, over 900 years ago, sat in complete darkness, in voluntary exile from everything he had built, and discovered exactly what this feeling is, where it comes from, and what it is secretly trying to tell you. His name was Abu Hamid Muhammad Al-Ghazali, and what he found will not just explain your anxiety, it will make you feel, perhaps for the first time in years, that someone has actually seen inside you. Let's begin with who this man was, because the story of his discovery is inseparable from the story of his collapse. By the year 1095, Al-Ghazali was the most celebrated Islamic scholar in the world. He was 37 years old. He held the most prestigious academic position in Baghdad. Students traveled across continents to sit in his lectures. His words moved governments. His reputation was almost mythological. And he was in agony. Not because anything bad had happened to him, precisely the opposite. He had achieved everything, and achievement had handed him a silence he did not know how to fill, a growing awareness that all of his knowledge, all of his brilliance, all of his status had somehow left the deepest part of him untouched. He began to overthink his own faith. Then he began to overthink his overthinking. He questioned whether anything he believed was genuinely real, or whether he had simply inherited a sophisticated system of intellectual performance. He questioned whether his spiritual life was authentic, or whether it was another form of ambition dressed in religious clothing. Then something happened that his own books could not explain. His body broke down. He lost the ability to speak, not from illness, from something that medical doctors of his time could not diagnose and that we today would recognize immediately. A complete nervous collapse driven by chronic psychological overwhelm. He stood before his students one day, and the words would not come. The man who had answers for everything had been silenced by something rising from inside himself. He walked away from everything. He left Baghdad. He left his position, his salary, his status, his students. He entered a period of wandering and solitude that would last over a decade. And in that silence, in the very emptiness he had spent his entire career trying to intellectually outrun, he found what he had been looking for. He wrote about it in a book called the Ihya Ulum al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences. But the psychological and spiritual discoveries buried inside that work are so precise, so accurate about the inner human experience, that reading them feels less like encountering history and more like reading a letter that was written specifically for you. The first thing Al-Ghazali discovered is something he called the disease of the heart. And the way he described it will feel uncomfortably familiar. He said that most human suffering, not physical suffering, but the invisible, relentless kind, does not come from what happens to us. It comes from what the heart becomes attached to. He described a particular state, a heart that is constantly reaching for certainty, reaching for control, reaching for a future version of life that finally feels stable, finally feels enough, finally feels like it won't be taken away. And the reaching itself, the endless, exhausting reaching, is the suffering. Think about your own overthinking for a moment. What is it actually doing? It is trying to protect you. It is running simulations, thousands of them, trying to anticipate every possible way things could go wrong so that you can feel prepared, so that nothing catches you off guard, so that you can maintain the illusion of control over an existence that is fundamentally, structurally, irreversibly uncertain. Al-Ghazali called this the qalb al-marid, The sick heart. Not sick in a moral sense, sick in the sense that it has become convinced of something that is not true, that if it just thinks hard enough, long enough, in enough directions at once, it will finally find solid ground. But the ground keeps moving, so the thinking never stops. And here is where he made a discovery that cuts even deeper. He said that the anxiety is not the problem. The anxiety is the symptom of a misplaced center of gravity. He used an image that has stayed with me, and I think it will stay with you. He described the human heart as a mirror. When the mirror is clean and still, it reflects what is real. It reflects the world accurately. It reflects divine light. It reflects truth. But when you coat the mirror with layer after layer of desire, fear, ambition, attachment, and performance, the mirror no longer reflects anything clearly. It shows you distortions. It shows you phantoms. And then you spend your entire mental life responding to those phantoms as though they are real threats. Your overthinking is not a sign that you think too much. It is a sign that you are responding to a distorted reflection and mistaking it for reality. Al-Ghazali said, the layers on the mirror have specific names. He listed them with clinical precision. Hawa, the pull of what you want over what is true. Kibr, the protective armor of self-importance that keeps you from being honest about what you actually feel. Hasad, the poisonous comparison that makes you measure your inner life against the curated surfaces of other people's existence. Ghafla, the numbing, the distraction, the spiritual sleepwalking that lets you get through days without once touching the real question underneath everything. And underneath everything, always the same question, never spoken out loud. Am I going to be okay? Not financially, not professionally, not socially. At the deepest level, am I, this inner person, this consciousness that wakes up every morning inside this body, am I okay? Does my existence mean anything? Is there something holding all of this together? Or is the spinning just the spinning, with nothing underneath? Al-Ghazali said that this question is not a psychological problem, it is a spiritual diagnostic. The anxiety is the soul trying to tell you that it has been looking for rest in places where rest cannot be found. Now here is where his insight becomes almost shockingly precise. He identified something he called the trap of future thinking, and he described it 8 centuries before modern psychology gave it clinical names. He observed that the suffering mind almost never lives in the present moment. It lives in a projected future that is always threatening to go wrong, or in a reconstructed past that it keeps returning to in order to find the moment where it should have made a different choice. He wrote that the heart that does not trust in Allah, not abstractly, not theologically, but actually, in lived experience, will colonize every available moment with either grief about what was or dread about what might be. And the present, the only moment where actual life is happening, becomes a transit point, a waiting room, a place you are always passing through on the way to some future state where things will finally be okay. You recognize this, I think. The feeling that you are always one achievement away from peace, one resolved problem away from being able to breathe, one conversation, one answer, one certainty away from finally feeling safe enough to actually be present in your own existence. Al-Ghazali did not tell people to simply stop thinking. That is not what he discovered. What he discovered was the specific form of surrender that anxiety cannot survive in. He called it tawakkul, but the way he defined it is nothing like the passive, resigned meaning the word sometimes carries. He said, tawakkul is not the absence of effort. It is the presence of trust while effort continues. It is the decision, made not once but continuously, to do what is yours to do, and then release the outcome from the grip of your thinking mind, because the outcome was never in your thinking mind's hands to begin with. He used an image of a traveler who has done everything correctly, packed their provisions, chosen the right road, prepared for the journey, and then spends the entire journey paralyzed by the fear that something might still go wrong. The preparation was real, the fear is imaginary, and the fear costs the traveler the actual journey, the landscape passing, the light changing, the experience of being alive and moving through a world that is genuinely, astonishingly present. He said that most of us are that traveler. We have done our part, and we have forgotten to let the rest belong to something larger than us. But he did not stop there. Because Al-Ghazali understood something that most spiritual teachers quietly sidestep, that knowing this is not the same as being able to live it, that you can understand tawakkul intellectually, you can explain it to someone else, you can quote the relevant verses, you can nod thoughtfully at the wisdom of it, and still lie awake at 2 a.m. unable to make your nervous system believe it. This is where he went into territory that feels almost contemporary in its psychological sophistication. He said that the gap between knowing and being is not a moral failure. It is not a sign that your faith is weak or your character is flawed. It is a sign that the work has to go deeper than the mind. The mind is where you understand things, but the understanding has to descend into the chest, into the qalb, the heart, the seat of your actual lived experience, before it changes anything about how you feel. And the journey from the head to the heart, he said, is the longest journey a human being ever makes. He described spiritual practices not as obligations to perform, but as technologies for making that descent. The purpose of dhikr, the repetitive remembrance of Allah, is not to accumulate reward or demonstrate religiosity. The purpose is to interrupt the loop, to insert into the spinning machinery of anxious thought a different frequency, something the thinking mind cannot argue with or analyze away. When you say the name of Allah 100 times in the quiet of early morning, not as a ritual but as a genuine act of returning, something happens that Al-Ghazali described with startling precision. He said the heart, which has been clenched around its fears like a fist, begins, involuntarily, gradually, to open. Not because the fears become resolved, not because the uncertain things become certain, but because the heart remembers, at a level below language, that it is being held by something it does not have to hold up by itself. There is a passage in the Quran that Al-Ghazali returned to again and again throughout the Ihya. Allah says, "Verily, in the remembrance of Allah do hearts find rest." He spent hundreds of pages exploring what that verse actually means experientially, not theologically, but in lived human terms. He said the word used for rest, tuma'nina, does not mean the absence of difficulty. It does not mean a life without problems, without grief, without the hard textures of human experience. It means a quality of settledness at the center of the self that remains even when everything around it is turbulent. It is the difference between a surface and a depth. A storm can be moving across the surface of the ocean with tremendous violence, while the deep water, miles below, is perfectly still. The storm is real, the violence is real. But the depth is also real, and it is more fundamental than the storm. He said the anxious person lives entirely on the surface, not because they are weak, because no one ever showed them the way down. The entire project of his Ihya, that massive, overwhelming, revolutionary book, is essentially a map of the descent. A set of instructions drawn from the Quran, from the Prophet, from the mystics and the philosophers, and his own decades of inner experience, for how to get from the surface to the depth. How to stop living only in the spinning and begin to touch the stillness that was always, always underneath it. And then Al-Ghazali said something that I want you to sit with. He said that your overthinking, that relentless, exhausting, sometimes unbearable mental noise, is not your enemy. He said it is a form of longing that has lost its address. The energy driving your anxiety is the same energy that drives genuine spiritual seeking. It is the soul's recognition that something is missing, that the surface does not satisfy, that there must be something more solid than this. The problem is not the longing. The problem is that the longing has been redirected toward things that cannot answer it, toward control, toward certainty, toward the approval of people who are as lost as you are, toward a future moment of security that keeps receding as you approach it. The restlessness is not a malfunction. It is a compass. It is pointing, somewhat desperately, somewhat chaotically, but consistently, towards something real. Imam Ali said, "The one who knows himself knows his Lord." Not the one who controls himself, not the one who fixes himself, the one who knows himself, who looks honestly at the spinning and asks not how to stop it, but what it is actually pointing toward. Al-Ghazali, in his decade of wandering, did not find peace by solving his questions. He found peace by discovering that the deepest question he had been carrying, the question underneath all the theological doubts, underneath all the intellectual anxiety, was not a question that needed an argument for an answer. It needed presence. It needed honesty. It needed him to stop performing certainty and sit inside his uncertainty long enough to feel what was there when the performance stopped. What was there, he said, was something he could only describe as light. So what does this mean for you, right now, in this life, with your specific and particular and very real anxiety? Al-Ghazali would say this: the thoughts are not the problem. The relationship to the thoughts is the problem. You have spent years trying to think your way out of anxiety, and the thinking keeps producing more thinking, because that is what the thinking mind does. It generates more of itself. You cannot use the machine to repair the machine. What you can do, what he discovered through years of genuine interior work, is learn to watch the thoughts without being consumed by them, to observe the spinning without being the spinning, to touch, however briefly, however tentatively, the part of you that exists prior to the noise. He said this is what prayer is actually for, at its deepest level. Not transaction, not performance, not the mechanical repetition of words while your mind is already somewhere else, but 5 actual moments per day when you place your forehead on the ground, and in that posture, that physical act of letting something other than your ego be highest, you practice, bodily, the release that the anxious mind cannot achieve through thinking alone. He said that the person who prays genuinely, who is actually present in the prayer, is practicing the most radical act of psychological liberation available to a human being. They are practicing the willingness to not be in control, the willingness to be held. And the strange thing, the thing that seems almost paradoxical until you experience it, is that the moment you genuinely release the need to hold everything together, the thing you are most afraid of losing becomes less terrifying. Because you discover that what you actually are is not the thoughts, not the fears, not the spinning, but the awareness in which all of that is happening. And awareness, Al-Ghazali said, does not break. He died in 1111. He was 53 years old. By the accounts of those who knew him in his final years, he had become something that his younger, brilliant, celebrated self could never have predicted, genuinely quiet. Not because he had no more questions, but because he had found a relationship to the questions that did not require them to be answered before he could be at peace. In his last days, he reportedly said that the greatest gift his crisis had given him was the destruction of his certainty. Because inside the rubble of everything he thought he knew, he had found something that could not be destroyed. He had found the stillness below the storm, the depth below the surface, the silence that had always been there, waiting, underneath all the noise he had been so expertly generating. That silence is not somewhere else. It is not in a different life, a better circumstance, a future version of yourself that has finally figured everything out. It is in you, right now, underneath the spinning. Al-Ghazali spent a decade walking through darkness to discover something you don't have to travel anywhere to find. Only down, only inward, only honest. The anxiety is not your sentence, it is your invitation. Tell me, has there ever been a moment, even a brief one, when the noise stopped and you felt something underneath it? When for just a second, the spinning paused and there was something quiet and solid there. What do you think that was?